The kitchen door at the Larkspur Social Hall stood propped open with a flat iron, and through it came the smell of wood smoke and cut apples. And under all of it, so faint that most people never noticed, the smell of a woman who had been standing at a stove since 4 that morning. Naomi Shaw did not go to the social. She had not been invited to go to the social, not in any way that counted. She had been told to bring the pies in through the back, to set them on the long table without her name near them, and to stay in the kitchen where a woman who cooked for wages belonged. She was 32 years old, and in the 2 years since her husband died at the bottom of a mine shaft outside Silver Plume, she had learned that a woman without a husband's name behind her own occupied a strange country. Not quite a servant, not quite a guest. Something the town had not decided how to place. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked once through the propped door at the lantern light, and the good coats and the long tables groaning with more food than Larkspur usually saw outside of a wedding, then went back to her stove. Her son Daniel, 7 years old, sat on an overturned crate in the corner, with a heel of bread and a book he could not yet read, but liked to hold anyway. She had told him to be quiet and small, which was a poor thing to teach a child, and she knew it, and she taught it to him anyway, because it kept a roof over him. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The arrangement with Verna Kettering had never been written down, which Naomi had come to understand was its own kind of statement. She cooked, cleaned, mended linens, and kept the boarding house accounts straight in a hand steadier than Verna's own. And in exchange, she and Daniel had the small room off the kitchen and $2 a month, paid when Verna remembered. It was not what Naomi had imagined for herself. Nothing about the last 2 years was. She had come to Larkspur from Ohio as a bride of 19, Thomas Shaw's arm around her waist, and a whole life laid out ahead of them like a road she could see the end of. The mine had taken that road away in a single afternoon, and what was left was a widow with a boy and a tin box of her mother's recipes, carried 2,000 miles because it was the one thing that had survived every move without breaking. Verna Kettering was not a cruel woman in the way that got spoken of at church. She did not raise her hand, did not raise her voice past what was proper. Her cruelty was quieter than that, and for that reason harder to name. She simply did not see Naomi, in the particular way that people choose not to see what is convenient not to see. When guests admired the boarding house table, Verna accepted the compliment with a small incline of her head and never once glanced toward the kitchen door. When the Ladies' Aid Society met on Wednesdays, Naomi served the coffee and was thanked with a nod, the same nod a person gives a chair that has been moved into a useful position. She had stopped expecting more than that. It was, she told herself, a kind of peace, to expect nothing and be occasionally surprised. The one thing Verna did see, the one thing she had built 4 years of standing in Larkspur upon, was the apple pie. It had started small. In Naomi's second autumn at the boarding house, Verna had gone through the trunk in the attic looking for a shawl and found instead the tin box, and inside it, in Naomi's mother's careful hand, a recipe that called for sorghum instead of half the sugar, and a lattice cut narrow instead of wide, and a particular fold of butter into the crust that Naomi's mother had learned from her own mother in a kitchen in Zanesville that none of them would ever see again. Verna had asked to taste it. Naomi, wanting to please the woman who held the roof over her son's head, had baked one. Verna had brought it to the Ladies' Aid Social that October and accepted 3 days of compliments as though she had built the oven herself. The next year, she had simply told Naomi to bake it again and to say nothing of it if asked. Naomi had said nothing of it. She had told herself it was a small thing, a slice of pie and a little pride, and prideful vanity was Verna's business to answer for on her own, not Naomi's to correct. She had a son to feed. She had learned, since Thomas died, to choose her battles with the precision of a woman who could not afford to lose one. There were smaller cruelties woven through those years too, the kind that did not announce themselves as cruelty at all. Louisa Kettering, home from finishing school in Denver with new opinions about everything, had once looked Naomi over at the supper table, taking in the mended hem and the sleeves let down twice over, and remarked to her mother, not quietly enough, that it was a wonder a woman could let herself go so thoroughly and still expect a decent situation to find her. Naomi had said nothing, only refilled the water glasses and gone back to the kitchen, because there was no situation to be won by arguing with a girl who had never once had to make her own hem last. The hired man who split wood for the boarding house had a habit of calling her the widow to her face, as though Shaw were a name she had misplaced rather than one she still carried, and correcting him had never once seemed worth the breath it would cost her. By the fourth autumn, the pie had become a fixture of the Larkspur Harvest Social, spoken of the way small towns speak of small legends. Verna Kettering's apple pie. Her grandmother's recipe, she told people, though her grandmother, so far as Naomi understood it, had never baked a thing more complicated than cornbread. Naomi baked it in the dark hours before the social each year, her hands moving through the motions her mother had taught her, and carried it out to the long table under a cloth, and went back to the kitchen and stayed there. This year, the social carried a different weight than usual. Everett Whitfield was in attendance. Everett Whitfield ran Cross Timber, the largest cattle operation in the county, 11,000 acres running up against the foothills west of town, and he did not often come to Larkspur's harvest socials, or to much of anything in town beyond what business required. He was 39 years old, a widower these 10 months, his wife Margaret, taken by a fever the previous January, in a manner that had left him. By every account Naomi had heard secondhand through the boarding house gossip, a quieter and more careful man than he had been before. He had a daughter, Callie, not yet 7, who had stopped eating properly sometime after her mother's death, and had not, by most accounts, fully started again. Verna had spent the better part of 2 weeks making certain the pie would be ready, the good tablecloth pressed, her daughter Louisa's hair curled just so. Because Everett Whitfield's good opinion was the kind of thing that reshaped a woman's standing in a county this size, and because, as Verna had said more than once at the supper table where Naomi served and did not speak, a man with that much land was still, underneath it, only a man with a motherless child and an empty kitchen. "You'll bake it Thursday night," Verna told her, 3 days before the social, not looking up from her ledger. Same as always. And Naomi, she had paused there, the way she always did before the part that mattered most to her. Not a word to anyone. Mr. Whitfield doesn't need to know whose hands did the work. He needs to know whose table it came from. Naomi had said, "Yes, ma'am," because that was what she always said, and had gone back to the wash. She thought about it that night, lying in the narrow bed, with Daniel's breathing even and slow beside her. She thought about her mother's kitchen in Zanesville, the window over the sink that looked out on a walnut tree, the particular way her mother had hummed while she worked. No tune Naomi had ever been able to name, just a low, contented sound that meant the day was going the way it should. She thought about Thomas, who had loved that pie so much he used to claim, laughing, that he had married her for it, and would confess as much to a preacher if pressed. She thought about how strange it was that the one thing she had left of both of them, her mother's hand and her husband's laughter, had become a thing she made in secret and handed over to another woman's name. She did not resent Verna for it in any large way. Resentment, she had found, was a fire that needed tending, and she had no fuel to spare. But some nights, lying still and listening to her son breathe, she let herself feel the smallness of it, the particular ache of being the one thing that made a room happy while remaining, herself, unseen inside it. Thursday night she baked the pie. She rose at 4, built up the stove, and worked in the dark kitchen with the window black above the sink, no walnut tree outside it, only the shape of the woodpile and the shadow of the barn. She measured the sorghum by feel. She folded the butter into the flour the way her mother had shown her, 3 folds and no more, and cut the lattice narrow, and did not think about who would eat it, or who would be thanked for it, only about the crimping of the edge, which had to be even, because her mother had always said an uneven crimp let the juice run, and a woman who let the juice run had not been paying attention to what she was doing with her hands. Daniel woke while she was setting the pie to cool on the sill. He came and stood at her elbow in his nightshirt, solemn the way he had been solemn since his father died, an old soul in a small body. "Smells like Grandma's kitchen," he said. He had never seen his grandmother's kitchen. He had only heard Naomi describe it, the walnut tree, the humming, often enough that it had become a place he could visit in his mind the way other children visited places they had actually stood in. "It does," Naomi said, and touched his hair, and did not say anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying between the two of them. He understood, in the plain, unquestioning way that children understand the shape of their own lives, that this was simply how things were. His mother baked. Another woman's name went on it. That was the arrangement, and he had never once asked her to explain it, which she was grateful for and sorry for in equal measure. The The social hall on Saturday evening was strung with lanterns and smelled of cider and pine boughs cut early for the occasion. Naomi carried the pie in through the back as instructed, set it on the long dessert table beside Verna's careful hand-lettered card, Kettering House, apple pie, and went back to the kitchen doorway to watch the room from a place where the room could not quite see her. Daniel sat on his crate with his book. Through the prop door she could see Verna in her good gray dress, moving through the crowd with the particular glide of a woman conducting a performance she believed she had written herself. She could see Louisa, curled and pressed, standing near the punch bowl with two other unmarried girls, all of them watching the door for a man whose arrival would apparently justify the entire evening. Everett Whitfield arrived a little after 7, and the room did what rooms do when a person of consequence enters them. It did not stop, exactly, but it reorganized, conversations tilting toward the door, voices dropping and rising in the particular register reserved for people worth being noticing. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who still worked his own land, rather than merely owning it, dressed plainly for a man of his means, and he had his daughter's small hand held in his own. Callie Whitfield was a slight child with her father's dark hair and an expression too careful for a girl not yet 7. The look of a child who has learned, the way children sometimes learn too early, to watch a room before trusting it. Naomi did not think much more about it. She had a stew to see finished for the kitchen crew, and a boy who needed his supper, and the doings of the social hall were, as they had always been, happening on the other side of a door she did not walk through. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. It was perhaps 40 minutes later that Callie Whitfield wandered away from her father's side and found her way, as children do, toward the one part of any gathering built for their scale rather than the adults. She pushed through the prop door into the kitchen and stood there a moment, taking in the warm stove and the crate in the corner, and the boy sitting on it with a book he could not read. Daniel looked up. "You can sit here if you want," he said, and moved over, because he was 7 and had not yet learned that some doors were not meant to be opened by children of his standing to children of hers. Callie sat. Naomi, stirring the stew, watched the two of them out of the corner of her eye and said nothing, because it was not her place to send a rancher's daughter back out to the party, and because the girl looked, in that unguarded moment, like a child who badly wanted somewhere quiet to be for a few minutes. "What's that smell?" Callie asked, not quite a question, the flat statement of a child too tired to shape her words into their proper form. "Apple pie," Naomi said. "Just baked it." "I don't like pie anymore," Callie said, in the same flat voice, and Naomi, without turning from the stove, understood something true about the girl in that sentence. Understood it the way she understood most things now, quietly and without being told directly. A child does not stop liking pie. A child stops liking the things her mother used to make her, because eating them means noticing, every time, that the hands making them now are not the hands that used to. "Would you like to watch instead of eat?" Naomi said. "Sometimes watching is easier." Callie looked at her for a long moment, weighing this, the way children weigh unexpected kindness before deciding whether to trust it. Then she nodded, and came to stand at Naomi's elbow while Naomi finished the stew, and asked her small quiet questions about the fold of the biscuit dough Naomi was setting up for the morning. And Naomi answered each one plainly and without hurry, the way she had once answered Daniel's, the way, she supposed, her own mother had once answered hers. It was the better part of 20 minutes before a boarding house girl came looking for the child and led her back out to the hall, and by then something in Callie's face had loosened slightly. The careful watchfulness eased just a little at the edges. Out in the hall, the dessert table had been opened, and Everett Whitfield, working his way down the offerings with the mild, obligatory interest of a man who had been placed in the position of guest of honor and understood the duties that came with it, had reached the slice of Kettering House apple pie. He ate it the way a man eats when he is not paying much attention to the eating, and then he stopped and ate the next bite differently. Naomi did not see this part. She heard about it later, secondhand, the way she heard about most of what happened in rooms she was not permitted to stand in. What she was told was that Everett Whitfield set down his fork and looked at the slice remaining on his plate and asked, in a voice that carried further than he perhaps intended, "Who baked this?" It was not idle politeness. Several people said so afterward. There was something in the way he asked it, a rawness underneath the plain words. The voice of a man who has been handed, without warning, a taste of something he thought he had lost. Verna Kettering, who had been 3 feet away discussing the church roof fund with the Reverend's wife, turned at the sound of her name's rightful province being questioned and answered before anyone else in the room had finished processing the question. "Why, that's my own family recipe, Mr. Whitfield. My grandmother's, from back east. I'm so pleased it pleases you." "It's remarkable," Everett said. "I haven't tasted anything like it since I was a boy. My mother used to put sorghum in the crust instead of all sugar. Nobody does that anymore." He looked at Verna with an interest that had not been there a minute before. An interest Verna had spent 4 years cultivating and had, in this moment, finally and fully earned in the eyes of the one man in the county whose good opinion mattered most. "A family secret," Verna said, and smiled, and Louisa, beside her, smiled too, sensing correctly that this was a good moment for the family to be smiling in unison. It was at this point that Callie Whitfield, who had followed the boarding house girl back out and was standing near her father's elbow with a small crease of confusion on her face, spoke. "That's not true," she said. The words were not loud. Callie Whitfield was not a loud child, had not been a loud child since her mother died, and what carried the sentence across the room was not volume, but the particular clean certainty of a child correcting an adult, a sound rooms cannot help but turn toward. Everett looked down at his daughter. "What's that, Cal?" "The lady in the kitchen made it," Callie said. "The one with the boy. I watched her fold the dough. She let me watch. This lady," and here she looked at Verna with the frank, unclouded judgment children are capable of, before the world teaches them to soften it, "wasn't even in the kitchen." The room, in the way of small-town rooms, went very quiet very fast. Everett Whitfield stood still for a moment, his eyes moving from his daughter's face to Verna Kettering's, which had gone through 3 expressions in the space of 2 seconds, surprise and denial, and something underneath both of those trying very hard not to surface. Then he set his empty plate down on the table and looked toward the propped kitchen door, where Naomi Shaw was standing with a dish towel in her hands, having come to see what the sudden quiet meant, and having arrived exactly in time to be seen by every person in the room at once. She did not move. She did not step forward to defend herself, did not step back to hide. She stood in the doorway with the towel in her hands and her son's small shape visible behind her on the crate, and she met Everett Whitfield's eyes across the length of the social hall with the same steadiness she had carried into every room that had failed to see her these 2 years, because she had long since stopped expecting rooms to see her and had never once let that stop her from standing up straight inside them. Everett crossed the room. He did not hurry, and he did not raise his voice. And when he reached her, he did not ask a question so much as make a quiet observation that happened to be true. "You baked this," he said. "Yes, sir," Naomi said. "Nothing more." "The sorghum in the crust. That was your idea, or someone's before you." "My mother's. She learned it from hers." Everett looked at her for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he has been searching for, without knowing he was searching. "It tastes like the last good year," he said, quietly, not entirely to her. The words of a man who had not planned to say something so unguarded in front of a room full of his neighbors, and had said it anyway because the pie had gotten past whatever door he usually kept closed. Then, seeming to recall himself, he added, "I'd like to know your name." "Naomi Shaw." "Mrs. Shaw." He nodded once, plain and formal, the nod of a man setting a fact down where it belonged. Behind him, the room had gone from silence into a low current of whispering, the sound of 40 people revising an opinion at once. Verna Kettering found her voice somewhere in the middle of all this, too late to matter and too loud not to be heard. "Mr. Whitfield, I assure you, there's been some confusion. The child is simply mistaken. She's very young. She doesn't understand the household arrangements." "Mrs. Kettering." Everett did not turn to look at her, which was, in its own quiet way, more devastating than if he had. "I don't believe your daughter is confused. I believe she told me something true, and I believe you'd have let me go on thinking it wasn't." Nobody in the hall said anything to fill the silence that followed. The Reverend's wife studied her punch cup with sudden great interest. Louisa Kettering's face had gone the particular shade of a person realizing, in public, exactly how the next version of this story would be told at every supper table in Larkspur for a month. Verna opened her mouth and closed it again, having discovered, perhaps for the first time in 4 years, that there was no version of the sentence that ended well for her. It was Mrs. Aldrich, 71 years old and Larkspur's oldest widow, who broke the silence, and she did it the way she did most things, plainly and without apology. She had known Naomi 2 years, had watched her carry baskets to the sick and mend the Reverend's coat without being asked, and never once heard her complain of anything, and she said, into the quiet, loud enough for the room, "That woman has more decency in her little finger than half this hall has managed all evening." It's about time somebody noticed. A few heads nodded. Ruth Coyle, who ran the post office and had weighed every piece of gossip that passed through Larkspur for a decade, said nothing aloud but crossed the room and took Naomi's hand and pressed it briefly, which from Ruth Coyle was as good as a speech. Everett Whitfield turned back to Naomi. "Mrs. Shaw," he said, "I've been looking for a housekeeper and cook out at Cross Timber since my wife passed. My daughter hasn't eaten a full meal without coaxing in 10 months. She ate a whole slice of that pie tonight and asked for a second." He paused, and something moved across his face. Careful. A man weighing a request against 100 private griefs he did not intend to explain to a room full of neighbors. "I'd be obliged if you'd consider the position. Fair wages. Room for you and your boy. I understand if you need time to think on it." Naomi looked past him at Callie, who was watching her with the same unguarded hope Daniel sometimes wore when he thought no one was looking, and then at Daniel himself, still sitting on his crate with his unreadable book held against his chest, watching his mother the way he had learned to watch her, for the smallest signs of what came next. "I don't need time," Naomi said. That was the whole of it. No speech, no accounting of the 4 years or the stolen recipe, or the small daily erasures she had swallowed to keep a roof over her son. She had never been a woman who explained herself at length, and she was not going to start in front of a room that had only just, tonight, remembered she existed. The days that followed moved quickly for Naomi, in the way that days move when a life is turning a corner it had stopped expecting to turn. She gave Verna 2 weeks' notice, plainly and without heat, and Verna, who had spent the interim between the social and Monday morning working through several stages of mortification and had landed somewhere near a chastened politeness, accepted it without argument. There was no scene. Naomi did not raise the matter of 4 years of stolen credit, did not demand an apology she suspected would cost Verna more dignity to give than either of them had the stomach for. On her last morning at the boarding house, she wrote out the pie recipe in her own hand, sorghum measure and lattice pattern and all, and left it on the kitchen table with a note that said only, "For Louisa, if she wants it," and walked out the door with Daniel's hand in hers and the tin box under her arm, owing nobody anything. The town's opinion of the matter settled, as small-town opinions do, into a story that would be told for years, softened at the edges, and sharpened at others depending on who was telling it, but always landing in the same place. The pie hadn't been Verna Kettering's after all. Naomi Shaw had baked it in secret for 4 autumns running and never once been thanked, and a rancher with a motherless daughter had walked into a social hall and, in the space of a single bite, seen what the whole town had been too comfortable to look at directly. Mrs. Aldrich told the version where she herself had spoken up first, which was mostly true. Ruth Coyle told the version where she'd suspected all along, which was less true but harmless. Louisa Kettering, for her part, wrote Naomi a short, awkward letter that autumn asking if she might visit Cross Timber sometime, to learn the crimping properly, and Naomi wrote back that she would be glad to have her, because there was no use carrying a grudge into a kitchen. Grudges curdled things. Her mother had taught her that too. 2 weeks after she left the boarding house, a basket arrived at the Cross Timber kitchen door, left without a note, though Naomi recognized the blue-checked cloth over the top from a dozen church socials and knew Mrs. Aldrich's hand in the jar of preserves tucked inside it well enough not to need a signature. She sent back a loaf of bread by the next wagon into town, and the two of them kept up a slow, wordless correspondence of baskets and loaves through that whole first winter, the kind of friendship built entirely out of things exchanged rather than things said. Cross Timber sat against the foothills in a fold of land that caught the morning sun early and held the evening light late, and the kitchen Naomi walked into that first week was larger than any she had worked in, well-built, well-stocked, and entirely unused to being loved. She set about changing that the way she set about most things, without announcement, simply doing the next necessary thing, and then the thing after it. She scrubbed the stove and reorganized the pantry and hung her mother's tin box on a shelf by the window, where the morning light caught it, and within a month the house had begun to carry the smell that had once belonged only to a kitchen in Zanesville, and, briefly and secretly, to the back room of a Larkspur boarding house. Bread, wood smoke, something with cinnamon in it more often than not. Callie Whitfield ate. Not everything, not always easily. Grief does not close a door so neatly that a single pie can shut it forever. But she ate, and some mornings she stood on the stool by the counter and helped fold butter into flour with the same solemn attention Daniel had once given his unreadable book, and Naomi taught her the way her own mother had taught her, 3 folds and no more, patience being the only ingredient that could not be measured. The 2 children, Daniel and Callie, found each other the way children left alone in large, quiet houses generally do. And within a season the ranch held the particular racket of 2 7-year-olds arguing companionably about something that would be forgotten by supper. He drove her and the children into town most Sundays for church, and sat beside her in the pew without comment from anyone, because a rancher of his standing driving his housekeeper to services was easily explained away by neighbors who wanted it explained away, and neither of them troubled to correct the explanation or confirm it. There was no hurry in either of them. Naomi had buried one kind of love already, and understood, in a way she suspected Everett was only beginning to, that the second kind, if it came at all, would have to be built slowly out of ordinary days, or it would not hold. Everett Whitfield was not a demonstrative man, and he did not become one merely because his life had improved. He was, Naomi came to understand across that first winter, a man built along the same lines as she was herself, careful with what he said, generous with what he did, uncomfortable being thanked and unwilling to go looking for thanks in return. He came in from the range most evenings and sat at the kitchen table while she finished the supper dishes, not saying much, simply present in the room the way a person is present who has decided, without needing to announce it, that this is where he wants to be. Some evenings he asked about her mother, about Zanesville, about the walnut tree outside the window she had described to Daniel so many times it had become a place the boy could see with his eyes closed. She told him. It was easier telling him than it had been telling anyone else, because he listened the way Callie had listened that first night in the boarding house kitchen, without hurry, as though the story itself mattered, and not merely what could be gotten from it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. On a clear evening the following October, a year almost exactly from the night of the harvest social, Naomi stood at the window of the cross-timber kitchen with a pie cooling on the sill, the same recipe, the same narrow lattice, the crimp even all the way around, because she had never once let the juice run. Outside, Everett sat on the porch step with Callie and Daniel arguing over a game of jacks that neither of them was playing by any rules Naomi recognized, and the last of the light was going gold and then pink over the foothills the way it did most evenings this time of year. And somewhere behind her the tin box sat on its shelf, her mother's hand still visible in the worn corners of the recipe cards, no longer a secret kept for another woman's name. She had not asked for any of this. She had only kept doing, quietly and without complaint, the small right things in front of her, the crimping and the folding and the plain care of a boy who needed feeding, long after the world had stopped seeming likely to notice. It had noticed anyway, in its own slow time, the way a room eventually turns toward the smell of something good coming out of an oven, whether or not it remembers to ask who put it there. She carried the pie to the porch. Everett looked up, and something in his face eased the way it always did lately when she came outside to join them, and Callie scrambled up onto the step beside her, and Daniel set down the jacks. He did not understand the rules of either, and for a while there was no sound on the porch at Cross Timber but 4 people and a pie and the particular quiet of a house that had, at last, been given someone to hold it together.